Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month I'm going to paint a dog. Let's start by sketching the dog. Drawing an animal is no different from drawing a portrait or anything else. You always start with the large shapes. So in this case, I can use my pencil and give myself a rough guideline for the shapes involved in this dog. So I have a large lopsided oval of a body and a circle head with a cone for a muzzle sticking out. So let me start with that oval for the body. And I'm just going to use loose strokes with a Conte crayon or a charcoal pencil. So I've got that oval, circle head, cone. Then I have these legs sticking off, and what I'm doing to add the legs is I'm looking where they line up in terms of these larger shapes. So you see that the bottom of this leg here sticking out is in rough alignment with the rest of this oval. So it should stick off straight. In order to know how long to make it, I'm just estimating how far from the muzzle to this line here, and that will give me the approximate place where the foot should end. So I'm not just drawing blind. Once I have the large shapes in place, I'm using those to help develop the placement of the smaller shapes. That ear is going to wind up about here to be in proper alignment with the foot. And here's his cute little front ear. So just keep your strokes nice and loose, and then when you've got things sketched out roughly, go ahead and erase those guidelines, and that will give you a better idea of how the overall dog looks. Don't be afraid if things just look like a great big mess at this point. They always do. After I've erased the lines, I'm going to go back into the picture and I'm going to tighten things up to make the picture more accurate. Since this is a painting class and not a drawing one, I'm going to go off camera to finish up this sketch, and I'll come back to you when I'm ready to start painting. Since you're painting the dog in watercolor, you have to consider your whites before you start painting. You're going to have to preserve your whites beforehand with masking fluid, or in case of larger areas, you'll just have to avoid them. So in this case, I'm going to avoid my whites and just start blocking in the large tawny patches, working around those white areas. So I'm going to mix up this sable color and then use a piece of scratch watercolor paper to make sure that I have it matched correctly. What I'm going to do is start with the lightest version of this tawny color and paint that everywhere I see it. So be aware as you paint that depending on how much water you've added to the paint, you're going to change the color. So it might look accurate when you've mixed it up and compared it to the card, but then lose its accuracy as you start painting. Here I go, just looking for these blocks of color, and notice how I'm working with the brush on the very edge so I can develop some patterns of the fur sort of sticking up here and there. And then I'm going to dip my brush in pure water and just wash the color out a little bit so that those lines don't get too edgy. Okay, just like this. But I'm still working around the lightest areas of the face. Then in the wet areas, I'm going to get a slightly different effect when I go back in with more paint, because here I'm painting wet into wet. So it's going to be softer and more cloudy. Just work slowly, and when you get to an area that needs to be a little bit more blended, go in with that wet brush and let that color get a little softer. Here I'm going to drop in a little bit richer yellow while the paint is still wet, and that will help it to stay a brighter color like what I see in the photograph, but will also kind of naturally blend itself out because the paint is going to follow the water. And I'm just varying the color in the coat by adding some different versions of the same color. Then in areas where it gets noticeably darker, like down here, I'm just going to add some brown to my paint and continue on in that same way. If I want the colors to blend, I'm going to use a damp brush and just mix into them like this. And I have some long hairs in the tail, so I'm just going to use that flat brush and like a whisk broom with hardly any water on the brush and develop the fur there that way. And that's where I'm going to leave it for now. I want that base coat to dry completely, And then in step 2, I can go in and add some shadow colors. Okay, and once that first coat is dry, you're going to start adding some shadow shapes. So I'm going to mix up a darker version of that same color. Use a test strip to double check yourself, and then I'm going to go through the same process and just carefully add some of those shadow shapes. But in little delicate areas like the ears, I'm just going to go slowly and carefully. And then when I get to larger shapes, I can use the broader side of the brush and go a little bit faster. And I'm just squinting at the reference to see where the shadows are, then I'm carefully adding them in large pieces. So see how I keep my reference really nice and close, and then I just paint what I see. I'm going to soften some of these edges by dipping back in before the paint has a chance to dry. And I use a wet brush to blend out some of those lines. And to get a little bit more variation, I can go back into those wet shadow shapes with a second color and mix it up a little bit, because dog fur is actually quite complex. It has a lot of different colors. So every time you make a pass, you can add to the complexity. I'm also going to use some dry brush techniques. I took a dry brush here and I'm just dipping it in a little bit of paint, a very little bit, and this makes really nice convincing fur. So with a stiff, flat brush, you can go back and drag through some of those wet areas and make more detailed fur. So you can see how using these two techniques together allows you to push the painting forward to another level of realism. Here I will carefully add a shadow shape on the dog's paw. And here, using a stippling technique, I can add some texture of larger fur clumps, like what you see on a long-haired dog. Now the white fur also is in shadow on the front paw, so I'm going to mix up a shadow color, and then I'll add that, leaving a little bit of the white on the top to be the area of the bright highlight. Okay, so now we've added some shadow shapes and I'm ready to let this piece dry a second time. When your shadow shapes are done, then it's time to move on to the details. So I'm going to get some black and some white and a small round. I'm going to start work in the eyes. So if you need to redraw anything, go ahead and do that before you start painting, and then just get close, take your time, and add those little details. So I've got some work in the eyes, and then I'll move down to the nose. For some of those washed out grays, I'm going to keep the paint on my brush, but just rinse some of it out and blot. And then I can add the shadow shape under the nose and these dots where the whiskers grow. And you can also use your small round to add some little shadow shapes in between some of those fur clumps or some additional long hairs. And there might be places too where you need to do some cleanup. So for that I'm going to use a small flat angled shader, get it wet, blot it off, and then go back and straighten up any lines that may have gotten out of bounds. Just rub, rub, rub. If the paint is fresh, it's going to come up easily even if it's dry. And then you can blot and then rub and blot a second or third time as needed. Here I'm going back into the ears with some of that gray, and I'm making some little strokes that can stand for small hairs. And I'm going to go back into the side of the head over here and clarify this line that got washed away. So this is the sort of little detail work that I'm going to do in this last stage of painting. Here I'm adding some more details to the paws using some of that gray. I'll clarify the lines between the paws and add some little flyaway hairs. I can also see some of his collar peeping through here. So I'm going to add the collar color, which is also black. And I'm going to carefully add that around some hair shapes so it looks like the hair is lapping over the collar. And then when the collar dries, I can also go in, add some white hairs with my white paint. Now to add the white paint, I'm going to clean off my same little round brush. I have my white paint separated from the rest of my palette because I don't want it to mix with my other colors. I can just dip into that white and then carefully go through over the top of dry paint and add some whites here and there where there need to be some clarified highlights or some sunstruck white fur. So on the tip of the chest and coming over the collar, places like this, I'm going to add a few little white hairs. You need to be careful when you're adding white though. You want to add the whites in enough places that they won't look like a mistake, but not in so many places that your painting takes on a chalky appearance. So stick to the rule of 3. If you put whites in at least 3 places, you'll be safe from making that look like a mistake. If you're worried though, continually take breaks, take a step back and see how the white is looking. And this is all there is to finishing up the piece. Now all I need to do is take the time to put in these little details and everything will be finished. So let me take some time off camera now, but then I'll be able to come back to you with a finished piece and show you what I came up with. Alright, here is the final painting. So you can see that all I did was add a few more details in the fur. I'll focus in here. I added some details in the fur. I softened a few highlights out around the eyes and in the muzzle, around the mouth, and I added a shadow to give the illusion of ground that he's sitting on. But now that's a finished painting. So you can see that painting a dog is really no different from painting a human, painting a landscape. You're going to work from the large shapes and then move in to work on the smaller details. Give yourself as much time with the details as you want and make it as polished and realistic as you care to. But that concludes this month's painting tutorial. I hope that you've learned something you can take away with you to your own workshop or studio, and I thank you so much for watching.